Previously on this channel, we've talked about the Nganasan, who are the northernmost people in Eurasia. We've also talked about the Greenlanders, and we've mentioned the Inuit and the Chukchi a few times, all of which are some of the most northern indigenous peoples in the whole world. But what about the opposite of that? What about the southernmost? Let me introduce you to the Yamana people, also known as Yahgan, native to Tierra del Fuego, the southernmost tip of South America, who proudly hold the title of the southernmost indigenous human population, which in turn makes the Yamana language the southernmost indigenous language in the whole world. Initially, the plan for this video was to talk about geography and classification, a little bit of history, and then move on to the linguistics of the language. Turns out the history of Tierra del Fuego is far more complex than I could have ever imagined. There are just so many stories that are absolutely mind-blowing, incredibly fascinating, but also utterly heartbreaking and kind of infuriating that I just could not believe, and I just felt like I needed to include as much as I could because I think it's very important to highlight them because most people I think have never heard of this stuff before. I know I haven't. Also, it all heavily involves other tribes native to the region. It's rather difficult to talk about the Yamana specifically without touching on their neighbors, such as the Kawe, sqar, the Haush, and the Selknam, because all of their histories are very much tied together. Basically, technically the main focus of the video are still the Yamana, because first of all, southernmost in the world has a great ring to it, and second of all, they do have the most information available about them, but we will still talk a lot about the other tribes as well. It's unbelievable to me how the stuff we're about to talk about is not more well known, and I desperately want someone to adapt it to a TV series several seasons long. Please. And because there is so much history and anthropology to talk about already, unfortunately we won't really be talking about the grammars and the sound systems of these languages this time, maybe in a future video. But that's because they're all from different families, there's just so much variety, they're so complex, and it's simply too much. But before we dive into it all, just one final thing. First of all, when reading about the Yamana people online, you'll notice that there are two main names that are used interchangeably: Yamana and Yahgan, with various spellings. Throughout the video, I will be referring to both the language and the people as Yamana, and you'll see why in a bit. Second of all, some people who are undoubtedly very fun at parties might point out that technically the southernmost people in the world are scientists in Antarctica, like the British, Argentinians, Norwegians, or whoever else. Well, none of these matter, because the key word here is indigenous. In any case, without any further ado, let's get into it. First off, geography and classification. The southernmost region of South America is called the archipelago of Tierra del Fuego, which means land of fire in Spanish. The most common theory for the origin of this name comes from the fact that early European explorers, when sailing past these lands, saw the entire coastline completely filled with fires built by the indigenous inhabitants, which sounds like it would have been an absolutely incredible sight to see. The whole archipelago is sort of split between Chile and Argentina, with the southernmost tip being Cape Horn on Hornos Island. Cape Horn is most commonly officially basically refers to the place where the South American continent ends. But I was kind of confused about this for a while because about 100 kilometers south are the Diego Ramirez Islands, which are also technically considered to be a part of the Tierra del Fuego archipelago. And while it turns out like, yeah, that's the case, like politically, yes, but Diego Ramirez is so remote, it's uninhabited except for a small meteorological station and a bunch of birds, that symbolically, culturally, historically, Cape Horn is officially sort of the end of South America. In general, this entire area, including the numerous Chilean islands to the northwest, has some of the most breathtaking landscapes on the planet. Mountains and valleys and fjords as far as the eye can see. It's like Norway on steroids, and everyone speaks Spanish. However, a bit further to the northeast, kind of closer to mainland Patagonia, it's just super flat grasslands with smaller rivers and lakes. But despite its natural beauty, it's not the most hospitable place to live. It can get pretty darn cold, and it's pretty windy and rainy all year round. It's important to keep this in mind when thinking of where the native peoples of this land lived. Anyway, because this area is called Tierra del Fuego, the people living here have historically been collectively referred to by the umbrella term Fuegians. The term Fuegians referred to a bunch of different peoples, but there are like 4, maybe 5 main ones, and those are the ones that we're going to be talking about. So let's take a look at this map, and I'll try to walk you through it. The Yamana, which are the southernmost, can be seen here in purple. As of the most recent national survey, there were approximately 1,600 people who claimed to be at least part Yamana, But the language itself unfortunately went extinct as a native language in 2022, when the last native speaker and simultaneously, allegedly, the last full-blooded Yamana person, Cristina Calderon, passed away. We'll talk more about her a bit later. Then there's the Kawe sqar, shown here in red. Sources are a bit all over the place in terms of how many individuals there are, ranging from a few hundred to a few thousand. And as for the language, there were only a handful of remaining native speakers, possibly less than 10, all of whom were elderly people. The Haush are to the east, and unfortunately both the ethnicity and the language are fully extinct at this point, and have been since around the 1920s. The Selknam over in the northern part of the main island were considered extinct for a bit, but then in the late 90s and early 2000s there were a few thousand people in both Argentina and Chile who declared themselves to be at least part Selknam. As for the language, the last definitive native speaker, Angela Loich Lopez, passed away in 1974. However, there were a few non-native fluent speakers remaining, with the youngest one, Chilean linguist Keyuk Yanten, being born in 1990, which is pretty incredible, and I wish him all the best in his endeavors to revitalize his ancestral language. Lastly, I want to mention the Tehuelche people, who technically aren't considered Fuegians since they were native to the Patagonia region north and east of all the other peoples. The reason I'm mentioning them is because when you look at how the languages are classified, the Haush, the Selknam, and the Tehuelche, and potentially a few other languages native to the regions even more into Patagonia, are officially a part of the Chonan language family. Meanwhile, the Kawe sqar language was either classified as a language isolate with many dialects, or a part of a small language family called the Alakulafan language family. Lastly, the Yamana language is officially considered to be a language isolate, meaning it's technically not related to any other language in the world. There have been many attempts in the past to link all of these to each other and also to other language families elsewhere in the continent, but so far none of it yield any concrete results, and due to a ton of different linguistic reasons, at least as of me making this video, this is how all of them are classified. Okay, I know that was a lot and probably a bit confusing, but all of it is very important for context. And this part is the one that I'm usually the most confused about, and I'm really trying my best not to misinform anyone and not to say anything wrong, so examining it in this way kind of helps me better understand what is important and what isn't. Either way, moving on. Even though the following is a bit sensationalized, to quote author Dallas Murphy, the Yamana were renowned for their complete indifference to cold weather. Although they had fires and small domed shelters, they routinely went about completely naked, and the women swam in cold waters hunting for shellfish. They were often observed to sleep in the open, completely unsheltered and unclothed, while the Europeans shivered under blankets. As a counter to that slightly sensationalist yet very interesting quote, here's another quote by English explorer W.S. Barclay. No human being could exist within the Arctic or Antarctic circles without clothing and shelter, but these Fuegian temperatures, aided by the constant use of fire, permitted the Yahgan to maintain a healthy, if Spartan, existence. The Yamana people adapted quite exceptionally to the living conditions of Tierra del Fuego. While for the most part they were nomadic hunter-gatherers, they did have small temporary settlements that they'd returned to throughout the year. They also built canoes which they used to travel across the countless bays and islands. They were also known to cover themselves in animal grease as a means to provide an extra layer of fat to keep warm. Obviously, very little is known about them prior to European contact. While this area was sparsely visited by European explorers as early as the 16th century, during Magellan's voyage for example, it wasn't until the first half of the 19th century when Europeans really started to settle in this area, and shortly after contact, the lives of the native populations would tragically never be the same again. There is honestly magnitudes more literature and information on European voyages in Tierra del Fuego than you'd expect, but I'd like to kind of highlight three main stories, three main chapters of this area's history, if you will, in chronological order that lead up to today. These chapters are as follows: the H.M.S. Beagle and the Four Captives, the Bridges family, and the Genocide. As you can probably guess, some of these stories are less fun than the others. Let's get into it. Starting off with the H.M.S. Beagle and the Four Captives. So the HMS Beagle was a massive ship of the British Royal Navy commissioned in 1820, and it went all around the world. In 1828, naval officer Robert Fitzroy takes command of the ship and sets out to explore and survey parts of Tierra del Fuego. At some point while there, some natives stole a boat off of the ship, and in response, Fitzroy kidnapped a bunch of them and held them as hostages on board. Most of them escaped, except for 4. These 4 would be taken all the way to England in 1830, and they would be taught the English language and all about Christianity, with the main purpose of that being to act as moral exemplars to their own people and as interpreters for passing English ships. The 4 hostages were as follows. There was Eleparu, renamed to York Minster. There was Yokchushlu, renamed to Fuegia Basket. There was Orundeliko, renamed to Jemmy Button, and Boat Memory, whose original name I cannot see mentioned anywhere. Eleparu and Yokchushlu were of the Kawe sqar people, while Orundeliko and Boat Memory were of the Yamana people. Sadly, Boat Memory would end up dying from smallpox shortly after arriving to England, but the other 3 would survive. They were placed with an Anglican church mission where they would spend about 10 months learning English and all about what's happening upstairs. In 1831, they were even granted an audience with King William IV and Queen Adelaide, who asked them about their ways of life back home. And allegedly, Queen Adelaide even gave the youngest of the captives, Yokchushlu, a gift of a bonnet and a ring and some money, which is pretty interesting. It's a wild story, and the 3 Fuegians actually became sort of like mini celebrities in England for a little bit, but then in December of 1831, they boarded the HMS Beagle once again, set to return back to their native homeland. This was the beginning of the second voyage of the HMS Beagle, led by the same Captain Fitzroy and accompanied by a certain 22-year-old graduate of the University of Cambridge, who some of you might have heard of, I don't know, pretty niche guy, called Charles Darwin. Darwin apparently conversed a lot with the 3 captives and apparently was super interested in them. And this entire voyage was apparently very instrumental in Darwin's later work on human evolution. And he even wrote a whole book about it called The Voyage of the Beagle, which apparently is one of his most famous works. And it's basically a huge memoir of his travels on the HMS Beagle halfway across the world, including the time he spent on the way to Tierra del Fuego. Nevertheless, I have to say that some of Darwin's thoughts made me see him in a slightly different light. I mean, I know this is like the 1830s we're talking about, but he kind of like ruined the vibe a little bit. When they arrived in Tierra del Fuego, Darwin met some native Fuegians, and he was comparing them to the 3 captives he met on board the HMS Beagle, who spent some time in England and therefore had become civilized in comparison to their native kin back in the homeland. And so he's quoted as saying the following. Without exception, the most curious and interesting spectacle I ever beheld. I could not have believed how wide was the difference between savage and civilized man. It is greater than between a wild and domesticated animal. It seems yet wonderful to me, when I think over all his many good qualities, that he should have been of the same race, and doubtless partaken of the same character, with the miserable, degraded savages whom we first met here. Again, like, I understand this was like supposed to be like 200 years ago and people had very different views back then, and maybe I'm just naive and I just don't know much about Darwin, to be honest, and I'm sure people will correct and enlighten me in the comments, but I don't know, I thought he was like supposed to be like ahead of his time a little bit. I'm just kind of disappointed, Charlie. In any case, so what happened to the 3 captives once they were returned back home? Well, Yokchushlu and Eleparu ended up getting married and having children and were spotted sporadically by missionaries and explorers over the next several decades. Eleparu died around 1873-ish. Yokchushlu later remarried and ended up passing away around 1883. As for Jemmy Button, otherwise known as Orundeliko, apparently he initially had a really tough time sort of readjusting back to his native language and customs, but eventually he managed to sort of join back with his family and live peacefully, relatively peacefully. Apparently later on, Darwin offered him a chance to kind of return back to England again, but Orundeliko said no, thanks, I'm good here. But apparently Orundeliko later even taught some of his family in Tierra del Fuego some English, which I find absolutely fascinating just thinking about. However, Orundelico did maintain some contact with the Europeans because eventually more and more started settling in there and encroaching in the area, setting up ranches and Christian missions, and Orundelico sort of acted as an interpreter and an intermediary between them sometimes. I'm not actually sure when exactly he passed away because two sources mention 1861 and another two sources mention 1866. I don't know, but one of his sons, called Three Boy, was allegedly taken back to England eventually to be educated as well, but there aren't many details about that, unfortunately. I highly encourage you to look up the story of the H.M.S. Beagle and the four captives. It's an absolutely fascinating story. There have been dozens of movies and books and documentaries and even music made about them over the years. There will be a few links in the video description below, including a blog called The Beagle Project, which goes into so much more intricate detail on the whole story. Highly recommended. Now, don't get me wrong, it's undoubtedly a very tragic story and there is just so much wrong with what the British did here. But looking at it purely through a historical and anthropological perspective, it's a mesmerizing read, and it's kind of one of those incredibly rare interactions and developments that you never expect to read about. The fact that three of the four captives managed to survive two voyages halfway across the world from the southernmost tip of South America all the way to England and then make it back home and then still live a relatively long life afterwards is absolutely mind-blowing to me. Can you imagine the culture shock they must have had? It's insane. And then taken back home, can you imagine them seeing their families once again? The families probably didn't think they would ever see them again, and then they did after like almost 2 years. And they like probably went like, guys, you will not believe what I saw. Like, it's crazy. It's absolutely fascinating. It's super sad and tragic all in all, but like, wow, genuinely. And with that, we are moving on to the next chapter, the Bridges family. More specifically, Thomas Bridges and his sons, who I can only describe as absolute legends. There was a man called Thomas Bridges. He was born in England in the early 1840s, and after a rough childhood and a series of various events, ended up on a ship on its way to establish a Christian mission on the Falkland Islands. He ended up staying there for years and learning the Yamana language from the natives at the mission, eventually becoming fluent, likely one of the only Europeans to ever do so. After spending about a decade there, he went back to England for a brief visit, got married, and then came back, this time to Tierra del Fuego, where he helped establish what is now today Ushuaia, the southernmost city in the whole world. Yes, there are settlements that are even more south than Ushuaia, like Puerto Williams, for example, but they're not really cities. They have like 1,000, 2,000 people at best. Ushuaia is like a proper city. It has over 80,000 people, the southernmost in the world. Fun fact, Thomas Bridges' house was actually the very first house constructed in Ushuaia. Anyway, he ended up settling there with his wife, having children, and completing a huge manuscript, which is the grammar and dictionary of Yamana English, with over 30,000 entries. It was lost and misplaced for a while, it was printed and reprinted, it changed hands a bunch of times, but it has one of the coolest prefaces and introductions that I've ever seen. It kind of details the creation of it and kind of all the work that went into it. Link in the description. It's super interesting. I can't recommend it enough. Thomas Bridges was actually the one who came up with the term Yahgan for the entire people. And as I mentioned briefly in the beginning, there's a slight discrepancy between the word Yahgan and Yamana, and I think I'll just let Thomas Bridges explain it himself. I gave these natives the name Yahgan because it was convenient. The Murray Narrows, near where our mission was established, called by the natives Yaga, may be considered the center of their land, and the language as spoken there was that which I learned, and its purest form being the mean between its varieties spoken southward, eastward, and westward. For these reasons, Yahgan seemed a suitable name, and is now known everywhere. And then later in the introduction, there's also this quote. Thus, those whom we call Yahgan called themselves Yamana, and this title has been selected as more strictly appropriate to a scientific work, while retaining the universally accepted name for the tribe themselves. So in the interest of sort of like keeping as true to the indigenous peoples themselves, I use the word Yamana in this video because that's what they most often call themselves. But the word Yamana is most often just man in other contexts, just FYI. In any case, interestingly, Thomas Bridges raised his children to also be curious about these indigenous languages and to help him out with this work. His son Despard compiled a dictionary of the sqar language, while his son Lucas, who will be mentioned a bit later, worked with the Selknam and the Haush peoples. Not just that, but apparently the whole family were very outspoken supporters of the indigenous populations trying to preserve their way of life. Apparently even offering some of them, particularly the Selknam, space on their vast 200 square kilometer property where they could continue their traditional ways of life without fear of the encroaching gold miners and ranchers. Unfortunately, this was very necessary, since beginning around the 1880s all the way up until the 1910-20-ishes was a horrendously tragic period of time in this area's history, titled the Selknam Genocide. Now, I really cannot do this history justice in this video, but before we continue on, I just want to clarify one thing because it may get a bit confusing. Let's refer back to the map really quickly. The Selknam are over here, while the Yamana are down there. All indigenous peoples suffered massively and were displaced, but the Selknam were specifically targeted, and their case is more explicitly documented, which is why in the following section I mostly discuss them. Anyway, in a very simplified nutshell, around the 1870s, small amounts of gold were discovered in some parts of Tierra del Fuego. Naturally, this attracted swaths of Chileans, Argentinians, and Europeans to flood the area in search of gold. Additionally, this area was and still is used for raising livestock, especially sheep, and many companies began setting up so-called estancias or ranches, and the Tierra del Fuego gold rush officially began in 1883. Now, we all know that one of the primary reasons for indigenous peoples dying out rapidly after contact with Europeans all over the world was disease. Measles, typhus, whooping cough, among many, many others. The local populations had zero immunity, so the populations began declining rapidly. And as if that wasn't enough, that's when the exterminations began. Big companies involved with the gold mines and sheep farmers paid militias a bounty for every dead Selknam by presenting a body part. And not just that, the Chilean and Argentinian governments didn't just know about it, they were helping out with it. Demographics and statistics are absolutely all over the place, but a rough estimate is that there were about 3,000 to 4,000 Selknam in the 1880s. By 1930, that number was now at barely 100. Roughly 90 to 95% of the entire Selknam population, a people, a culture, a language dating back who knows how many hundreds or thousands of years, gone. Hunted to extinction in just a few decades. Future Sean here while editing, I'd like to clarify one thing. In the classification section, I also said that in the 90s to 2000s they were considered extinct as a people, but today they're supposedly a few thousand people. That is confusing as heck, and I need to explain. First of all, as is universally the case in these types of videos, statistics are generally inconsistent and may vary wildly. The few thousand people today are sort of people with ancestry / people who just identify as Selknam. Plus, the Chilean and Argentinian governments didn't even recognize this happening until very, very recently. So, nobody cared to fact-check. You're encouraged to be mildly skeptical about the numbers you see. Anyway, happy watching. And you want to know the best part? Nobody was ever really held accountable. There was a small inquiry in the early 1900s that just went absolutely nowhere. All in all, a few random farm workers were convicted and released after a few months. That's it. That was the end of it. There were so many people at fault here, especially this one particular piece of shit called Julius Popper, who I don't really care to discuss. Google him if you're curious, I guess. And not just that, but the Selknam and other Fuegian peoples were captured and placed in human zoos on display. I don't really want to show any pictures of that either, so Google that as well if you're curious. When it comes specifically to the Selknam genocide, neither Chile nor Argentina ever issued a formal apology. The only thing that they officially did was recognize the Selknam as one of the respective countries' indigenous peoples, and acknowledged that a bunch of bad stuff happened here, which opens up the door for claiming land rights and political representation, among other things. But can you guess when they did that? What year? Take a wild guess. I'll wait a second. Argentina in 1994, with the official commemoration date set to November 25th, and Chile in 2023, with no commemoration day or anything else really from the Chilean side. Argentina at least put in the most minimal effort. Chile doesn't seem to care as much, at least for now. I'm not really sure how to end this section because it's really depressing and I wish it wasn't so. The only light at the end of the tunnel here were the Bridges family. As mentioned, Thomas Bridges and his family were as integrated with the indigenous populations as Europeans could ever hope to be back then. They learned their languages, they provided them with land, shelter, aid, and whatever else they needed, But unfortunately, there's really only so much a single family can do against thousands of gold miners, sheep farmers, and two governments. If it wasn't for them, we'd probably know very little about these peoples, their languages and cultures, even less than we do today. And don't get me wrong, there are obviously other people who were trying to help in some sort of way and were very sympathetic to the indigenous peoples, but the Bridges family specifically are like just the most shining example of that. And yes, they were missionaries, and you could argue that they shouldn't have tried converting them to Christianity. Like, not everything has to be about Jesus, but back then, missionaries were the OG linguists and anthropologists. It is what it is. And I think they did a great job at fostering a sense of love and acceptance, like real Christians should, by the way, when seemingly everyone else on the continent was out to murder the indigenous populations just to make a few bucks. Last thing I want to mention in this section is that Thomas Bridges' son, Lucas Bridges, who I mentioned earlier, wrote a book in 1948 titled The Uttermost Part of the Earth. It's pretty much an autobiography of his and his family's lives. He describes what it was like to be born and grow up in Ushuaia in the late 19th century. He talks about his journeys, him learning the Selknam language and interacting with the people, and it's honestly an incredible book. I haven't finished it yet, but I highly, highly recommend, and it's just link in the description. Also, someone, again, seriously, someone needs to make a movie or a mini-series about this. It's incredible. And now we reach the modern day, shifting from the Selknam back to the Yamana people, the southernmost people in the world. The last native speaker and allegedly the last full-blooded Yamana person, Cristina Calderon, passed away at her home in Punta Arenas, Chile at the age of 93. And with her went her ancestors' ancient and unique language. Unlike for the Selknam, Chile did actually recognize and honor her in a bunch of different ways throughout the early 2000s. And when she passed away, the governor of the Magallanes region where she lived actually declared a 3-day mourning period for her. It's worth mentioning that one of her daughters, Lidia Gonzalez, is actually a Chilean politician who was elected to hold several different offices throughout her career, mainly aimed at representing rights of indigenous peoples in Chile, the first Yamana person to ever do so. But quickly, I just want to rewind a bit and say one last thing about Cristina Calderon. There are several articles that mention that by 2004, she and her sister-in-law, Emelinda Acuna, were the only two remaining native speakers. The sister-in-law passed away in 2005, and for the next 17 odd years, Cristina was left as the only one. Now, of course, there were and probably still are some people who know some words and phrases and so on, but can you imagine what it must be like to be one of only two people in the whole world who grew up speaking this complex language that's unlike any other language in the world? Remember, Yamana is a language isolate after all. And then the other person passes away, and suddenly you don't have anyone in the world to fully express yourself with in your native language. I feel like it's incredibly sad. At the same time, I don't really want to end this on a depressing note. Cristina Calderon is a legend, and she worked hard to preserve her ancient culture. She was universally loved by all and was even called abuela by everyone because she was, like, by that point, she was just everyone's grandma, you know? And it's the best, and I'm sure her memory will live on for a very long time to come. One very last thing that I want to mention about the Yamana language is that I discovered this Wikipedia article about a word in the Yamana language, which is Mamichlapinatapai. Mamichlapinatapai, which actually got listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most succinct word. And it's considered one of the hardest words to translate, which, like, this is one of those claims that it's like saying, you know, like what is the hardest language in the world? It's one of the, no such thing as one of the hardest things to translate. Like, this is just, you know, but still a cool thing. And the word itself means a look that without words is shared by two people who want to initiate something, but that neither will start. Or a romantic interpretation of the meaning has also been given as that look across the table when two people are sharing an unspoken but private moment, when each knows the other understands and is in agreement with what is being expressed. An expressive and meaningful silence. And I don't know, I thought it was a weird, melancholic coincidence that this is the word that was listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most succinct word. It's really interesting. I'm sure everybody knows this feeling. Everybody has experienced this feeling before. A cool, fun fact. I don't know how fun it is, but it is a very interesting fact in my opinion. Mami Chapinatapai. And with that, today's video comes to a close. Again, apologies for not really talking about the languages themselves in this video, but I just had to get all of this history out because it's unbelievable to me, and it's just so interesting and so cool and so sad, and the languages are so complex and so different from each other that it just didn't feel very viable to do it in this video, which is long enough as is. And to all the indigenous peoples of Tierra del Fuego and of Chile and Argentina in general, I wish you all the absolute best, and I truly hope that your cultures survive for a very long time to come. Maybe that seems overly optimistic of me to some, given, what we just talked about, but who cares? Wishing someone good doesn't cost anything, and there are people in the world still to whom this is very important, and that's what matters. And anyone who tells you otherwise is wrong, and you shouldn't listen to them. That's about it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day and a wonderful night. See you soon, and now enjoy an outro of me reading a short story in Yamana. Hawanshi inatara liush keputakute waata warushun taulum, hai hiwai tenakupai mawaku hach, hau akar kiwai atamupai mötta wella pich, köninur akulainute yamuka, Hushantaki tulara yonatöpan. Haipaf hateki yamostaliantayan ashunan, kiwan kyotaku lainuteaka kyotakitan kisitara. Haitöpan hatalakön shulöpata worush yarum. Husha kömiamin kayata apailoapan, könchin kötakoa hayananima mawakupanaka. Haitöpan hotaskölikönoa mamashupai hayama watua hau akatupai. Good night, everyone.